Good morning to those people in Europe who are joining us. Good afternoon to those people in Asia. My name is Xian Hui. You can call me HH for expediency because it's very difficult to pronounce my name. I'm the head of venture investing for SGInnovate, and I've got the signal honor today of being the moderator for this fascinating session on the future of urban mobility in a post-COVID-19 world. I'm emphasizing the title in case someone just strolled in and wandered into this webinar by mistake and not sure what exactly this is all about. But please don't leave. I think that this is going to be a fascinating session. We've got very distinguished panelists and speakers who are going to be talking very knowledgeably on the topic, and I'm sincerely looking forward to it. As we all know, mobility is one of humanity's greatest challenges. This very simple act of moving people, products, and services from one point to another has preoccupied generations past, present, and I'm supremely confident will preoccupy future generations as well. At Singapore, as SGInnovate, we believe technology has a big part to play in addressing global challenges, such as mobility. We always seek to frame emerging technologies and contextualize them within the larger problems they aim to address. My colleagues and I in the investment, ecosystem development, talent, and venture building help entrepreneurial scientists adopt these technologies to build businesses that tackle such challenges and these problems that we face. We are therefore very excited to partner with the UNDP and their Global Center for Technology, Innovation, and Sustainable Development to bring you this series under the SDG innovation, of which this is the 5th. And I've got the very great pleasure of introducing Ms. Alba Fuster to take it from here and to deliver her presentation. Alba, please.
Alba, you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Hensui. I will just be providing some food for thought before we begin with this amazing panel of experts. We'll begin the discussion in a few minutes. So I am from the Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development here in Singapore. We're a global center from UNDP, with United Nations Development Program, which works through a network of 170 offices in low and middle income countries. And we as a global center from this network, we provide assistance to these country offices in the development of projects related to technology and innovation. So today, just to introduce a little bit the topic and localize the urban mobility within the context of urban, the Agenda 2030. Mobility does not have a specific SDG by itself, but it does have urban mobility does have a target within the SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. So this target is by 2030 to provide access to safe, affordable, and sustainable transport systems for all. And the indicator proposed to follow up this target is the proportion of population that will have access to transportation. In 2017, the average world proportion for this indicator was that 53% of citizens had access to transportation, and this percentage was as low as 18% in some sub-Saharan countries. So there's still a lot of work to do. And also mobility also relates to other SDGs and specific targets from other SDGs too. So as a horizontal aspect. So why is urban mobility relevant and important to be discussed? First of all, for the increasing urbanization. So by 2050, the world's urban population is expected to reach 66% of the total global population. But specifically in Africa and Asia, we see that in these regions, we already expect that by 2030 or before, that half of this population, so more than 50%, will be living in cities. And besides, respect also that from the 12 expecting new mega cities that will be appearing in the following years, the majority will be in Africa and Asia. So it's also quite important to contextualize geographically this challenge. Mobility is important also not for the sake of mobility, but also because it's an enabler for people to access resources and for their human development. So thanks to mobility, people can access jobs, they can access health services, education, recreational activities, etc., which is quite important for the inclusivity of all the very specific groups and general population. And also mobility is quite important because of the climate change imperative. So as we see, cities are responsible of 70% of greenhouse gases emissions and 60% of energy consumption. And already in 2017, we saw that low and middle income countries were expected to have bigger emissions than the most industrialized countries. So also again, the geographical dimension is important. And finally, it's also important for a matter of public health. So urban air pollution and noise pollution have been considered by the World Health Organization as the most important pollutions impacting the health of humans. And already we see that 90% of low and middle income countries' cities do not comply with the target set by World Health Organization that is safe to have in this pollution. So there's also a lot of work to do in those domains. So we have seen that COVID-19 has affected very differently the different actors and domains of urban mobility. So from one side, we have seen that it has provoked big financial stress on public transportation systems, which have seen the passenger numbers drop by 80 or 95%. So it has been quite dramatic in terms of revenues that the public operators have been receiving. And also they have seen an increase of costs because they were still providing in many cities the basic services and combined with costs for the cleansing and safety, etc. So many of these operators are already surviving thanks to public subsidies, cash reserves, or cutting other budgets, and they are in some of them in very delicate situations, especially because we do not know when demand for public transportation will be at pre-COVID levels. On a more positive note, we have seen quite a big increase of bicycle use and extension of bike lanes. So we have cities like Berlin, Bogota, Barcelona that have been expanding bike lanes, and also we have seen a lot of pilot in many African cities like Kampala, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, related to the promotion to non-motorized transport. So this has been a very interesting trend to observe worldwide during the COVID-19 situation. And on the other side, we have seen also that shared and micromobility options have been having quite a difficult time. So because they were perceived as less safe, there has been a very important decline in use for this kind of mobility. However, it is interesting to see also how fast they have adapted their strategies. So they have targeted new users, they have changed in their operations to ensure safety, etc. So they have been really reactive to the crisis. So hopefully it will be better after when we go back to normality. Also, we all know the changing mobility patterns. We are now all familiar with working from home, but also there has been a lot of emergence of remote education, e-health services, etc. So we will need to see in terms of demand how this continues after COVID situation is more regularized. And also in terms of private car ownership, there are some concerns about the increase of the use of private cars and motorized vehicles, precisely because there have been some surveys, especially in China, where there has been observed that many people saw the private car as a more suitable, desirable mobility option to work after COVID, because it seems more safe, and also more people were thinking about buying a car after this situation. So there's also this concern about how the private cars will evolve. And also we have seen that the startup ecosystems, especially mobility startup ecosystem, have been suffering a lot too, to the extent that in some reports regarding mobility startups in Africa said that up to 80% of viable mobility startups might not survive COVID-19 situation. So it is also important to highlight the effects on the future innovations. So this is my last slide. So just after having seen the developments in the domain of mobility before and during COVID-19, I think that we have really interesting times ahead in which policymakers will be taking decisions that will most likely define the mobility of the following years. And I think that for these decisions, they will need to take a very holistic and systemic approach. So some of the pieces of the puzzle that we have here on the mobility domains can be explored in terms of how tech and innovation can can contribute to that. So for instance, in the domain of electric vehicles, they are for sure a cleaner alternative to motorized vehicles and can help diminish greenhouse gases emissions. But at the same time, we need to take care of, we need to think about where is the energy feeding these electric vehicles being produced, how it is being produced, and whether it is clean or not, and also which kind of mobility do we want for our cities, if we want electric vehicles traffic jams, or if we want to promote other kinds of mobility. In terms of shared mobility, there's also a big possibilities in terms of technology and innovation, be it in new devices, on how to improve these devices to these changing times and making them safer and cleaner. Also in terms of innovating in business models and even in the role that they take in the city. So they might be very good for last mile or for some kind of users, but they might not be the most inclusive mobility for some of the groups. Then another area that is quite interesting is informal transport. So informal transport is the unregulated and more flexible transport that has not fixed prices, routes, etc. So it's not regulated by a public authority. But in some developing countries, it's 80% of the mobility users rely on this kind of informal transport to make the normal commuting. So it's also very interesting to see how the COVID-19 situation might have affected them and which measures will be taken from this sector. Then in terms of public transportation, as said, it will be a very big and important debate from public authorities, how they will look for innovations and new methodologies and approaches to make it more efficient and reduce cost and make it more attractive and communicate the safety, etc. Walking and cycling will also be interesting to see the sustainability of that, because we also need to think about the design of the city, because not everything is at a walkable or cyclable distance. So, and it also requires infrastructure and investment on that. And then what we do with the startup ecosystem and how we can support the solutions of the future in terms of urban mobility. So that it is all from my side. I give back the floor to Hensui. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alba. And for the very interesting presentation. I'm sort of betting that, you know, some of the members of the audience are going to be asking whether you can share those slides, but I'm going to let Wei Ming take that offline with you later on. For those of you who will have questions for our panelists, just an administrative detail, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen instead of the chat, so that it's easier for me to screen it out and to look at which questions you know, to pose to the panelists. So without further ado, let me get into the meat and potatoes of today's session. We have a very balanced panel. We have a researcher in this space. We have a policymaker and scenario planner in this space. We have someone who has actually commercialized ideas in this particular space. So without further ado, I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, say what they do, and I'll let you guess which one fits into which of the buckets that I've just described. So ladies first, Lynette, maybe you can share with us a little bit about yourself, what you do.
Yep. Hi everyone, good afternoon from Singapore. Very glad to have this opportunity to talk with you. Thank you, Xianhui and the team, for inviting me to come in. I'm very encouraged with the whole SDG series and the focus on sustainable development. So I think this is a good direction. I teach engineering systems at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. My research examines the environmental impact of urban mobility. So with my research team, we developed data-driven models and simulations of road transport for both passenger and freight movements. So I was quite happy when Xianhui introduced, he talked about the urban mobility covering the movement of people, products, and services. So I think it's important to pay some attention to freight or goods movement in cities, because it's not easy to plan for and sometimes overlooked, and freight vehicles may make up a small fraction of the total road vehicle fleet, but they actually contribute more towards the total vehicle kilometers traveled, and also are responsible for disproportionately higher impact on air and greenhouse gas emissions. So this affects our global warming impacts. It also affects the air quality around us. So in recent work, we've done quite a bit examining last mile urban logistics solutions and trying to come up with ways to reduce the impact of freight transport.
Okay, thanks, Lynette. Maybe we can have Andre to introduce himself next.
Thank you so much, and humbled to be here. So I'm Andre Berdychevsky. I'm leading the Global Future Mobility Solution Center in Singapore for Deloitte. For the ones who don't know Deloitte, we are the largest professional services organization globally with about 320,000 employees. And we defined one of our strategic priorities as future mobility. We call it the bold place, and been investing into the space since 6 years, actually, into thought leadership, into project development, into solution development. And we decided to put our skin in the game here in Singapore, where we see a lot of innovation happening, and bring it from Singapore globally to the world. So the Future Mobility Solution Center defined its mission as igniting collaborative shifts in mobility for good, which means we are co-creating digital solutions. We're doing a lot of ecosystem engineering, so bringing all the players of the mobility ecosystem to understand the issues and tackle them together in a collaborative approach. And then also doing topics like Venture Connect, so connecting our clients with the mobility ventures in the space, which they need to do. To my person, I've been working on the mobility topics since 14 years across 3 continents. I was head of automotive for the World Economic Forum, where I was also contributing to define, for example, the CEO declaration to decarbonize automotive transport for the Paris Climate Agreement. And I started the urban mobility practice for the World Economic Forum globally.
Okay, thanks, Andre. And last but not least, the gentleman who has chosen perhaps the toughest path amongst all of us to actually bring to market, urban mobility solutions in Vietnam, I believe. Justin, please take it away.
Hi, thank you for having me here. Yes, you are very right. Vietnam is one of the toughest markets, but we are not only in Vietnam. At the same time, I'd like to thank Elba. She has summed up everything that we do in a little presentation that she did earlier on. So anyway, my name is Justin. I'm the CEO of Kit Global. Kit Global is a deep tech company that builds and shared electric vehicle platform that uses technologies to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles and bridging the gap of autonomous vehicle future. So our aim is to provide the low-cost transport for the masses and increase economical value for within the community as well. So how do we do that? We ensure that a shared transportation platform can be utilized round the clock, serve multiple industries or target audiences, and relieve the burden of financial stress from the governments. So in this space, what we are trying to do is a lot of things, right? We are trying to build a vehicle platform, we're trying to build a software platform, and we are trying to make sure that it's not only used by a certain market of people, but we are trying to branch it out so that when it is being shared across different sectors and different industries, the cost of ownership becomes so low that everyone can now use it. And this brings extreme value. Thank you, guys.
Okay, Justin, I'm going to stick with you for the first question, and it's an extrapolation of what you have just said. You have painted a very nice vision, and obviously the challenge on the ground, the myriad challenges to what you have just said. You've made it sound very simple, but I think one of the key challenges is really changing the mindset of consumers. I mean, you've got this nice platform and all that. How do you get people to actually buy into this, especially Vietnamese, or sorry, those people in countries where the digital economy is maybe not the most developed?
Well, okay, that's extremely good question. So when we talk about customers on our end, right? So we have got the people that will be largely benefiting from this platform, which is the end users themselves. So what we do over here is that we actually have got a whole framework, okay, where we not only tie up with government sectors and the operators locally in that country to actually help us launch a product. So this is one of the key things that we need to do. And it's this relationship that we built that will allow us to have access to the public or the end users themselves. And we structure out this formats into 3 parts. One is cost. Okay, by lowering the cost of such a shared platform, we are now ensuring that these vehicles can be used by everyone, with little money. And how do we do that? Is basically to actually share this cost between the commuters and the freight or the logistics sector themselves. So just imagine the same vehicle that you use to commute to work is also shared by a logistic operator like Lazada, for example. And this way, everyone shares the cost. So that's cost to drive the whole operational cost down. Second, the max utilization. Now that the cost is low, utilization will be adopted across. Okay, and if we need an electric vehicle to be used by everyone, we need to ensure that the viability of the fuel is there. So the energy required to move an electric vehicle is always there. And therefore, we now want to make sure that these vehicles are utilized round the clock. So we have got max utilization as well. And when these vehicles are now used all the time, we bring it to the last part, which is education. Just imagine if you're driving a car not knowing what technology goes into it, but after a year or so, if the education were to stretch out and I were to tell you, say, hey, do you know that this car has got fast charge? Do you know that this car has got an autonomous function? And this is the part that since you've been using to it, you are just going to accept whatever technologies that's coming your way. And therefore we can drive this movement to actually have consumers be comfortable with the future technologies that will be implemented in whatever platform that is available in the market.
Okay, thanks, Justin. I mean, I'm just seeing a couple of questions on the Q&A already, which seems to be setting itself up nicely for Andre to reply, because Deloitte recently published a great paper on the impact of COVID-19 on mobility, of which Andre was one of the co-authors. So maybe, Andre, maybe you can, I'm going to just jump to that and ask you to perhaps share some of the findings and some of the scenarios that came out of that paper.
Yeah, sure. So I think the question you're referring to is how will mobility, and specifically the shared mobility, look post-COVID-19, which we get asked a lot. And the truth is nobody has a crystal ball, right? So making any predictions in the volatility we see today, I believe would be a fool's errand. But leaders cannot also be completely inactive. They have to engage. And that's why we went for a scenario approach. And scenarios are understanding how different factors might play out in different futures. And the way we look at it is, on the one hand side, how severe will the pandemic be, and then how much collaboration which we'll have, right? And we see actually the two extreme scenarios. One is we call the passing storm. So this is where we get out of the pandemic quite quickly. You can look at the China scenario today, and there is stabilization coming back, old patterns coming back. What we see in China right now, for example, as part of this scenario, is that the vehicle sales, for example, are taking off again. So people are preferring more personalized travel because it's safer, and they want to have the safety to travel more individually. The other extreme would be the lone wolf scenario. This is where the pandemic is quite severe and we don't see much collaboration and everybody's fighting for themselves. This is where a government has to step in and regulate mobility, right? And we see innovation actually coming from different other sources, like the military being now the innovation driver. The two scenarios in the middle we call the good company and the sunrise in the east. The good company describes the future where the private sector is driving the recovery phase from COVID-19, and we see much more innovation also coming from the private sector, the government becoming more of a junior partner, whereas sunrise in the east describes the balance shift where we go more towards a faster recovery in the east, and innovations from the east, like license plate regulation, like the topics of electronic road pricing, are becoming adopted in the West. So following the examples of Singapore, of China, bring the adoption in the West. This is where we also see more movement towards environment and electric vehicle, as the customers here in the region are more open in adopting new technologies, but also more open in sharing their data. So you see a lot of dependence. I think some of the things which we will see is definitely more reliance on e-commerce, reconfiguration of the mobility landscape, customers being more cautious about their safety as they choose the mode of transport, and then of course the trip substitution through digitization. So something we're doing right now, right? Not being in a room, but being in a virtual room with each other. And we'll see it a lot in medicine and education, in telecommuting. Taking these business models will get adopted more and more.
Okay, thanks, Andre. Maybe a question for Lynette. probably an extension of what you said in the introduction. You mentioned, a lot about low carbon transport and all that. What do you think are the most effective pathways to achieve low carbon transport in cities, and how can things like data help in establishing those pathways?
Right. I think like what the other panelists have been mentioning, I think for passenger transport, if we can shift or reduce travel demand entirely by shifting towards these alternative ways of communicating, meeting, like through teleconferencing, video conferencing, I'm hopeful that this will stick, and at least for those that are able to continue doing so. I think fundamentally in cities, promoting active mobility, like the cycling, walking modes, and public transport or mass transit will continue to be the key. The carbon footprint of taking a public bus or MRT, it's an order of magnitude less than taking a car or a taxi. So while there is some interest in more private modes of transport, we have to keep encouraging the use of mass transport. I think we're clear on the benefits that public transport has. Other than minimizing the energy and environmental impact, it enhances the quality of urban spaces, allows for high density living in cities. So cities need public transport as much as public transport needs cities, and it's also more equitable. So like what Alba was mentioning in the earlier slides, introducing the goals for sustainable mobility, we will need public transport to thrive. For freight transport, it's a bit more complicated. It's quite context specific. I'm sure the case in Vietnam is quite different from us in Singapore. So there are a few general challenges that all cities face. Firstly, the freight system is characterized with many different actors, many different interests. So while individual fleets are optimized, the movements overall are not optimized on a city scale. So finding some ways to encourage this collaboration among competing companies would be helpful. E-commerce was mentioned. It's also rising very rapidly, and it's a concern. Of course, right now we're in a transient phase where a lot of people are ordering more things online. We probably will continue to see this trend. But many studies, including the one that we're doing now in Singapore, is suggesting that more vehicle trips will result when people order things online. So it's not a substitution effect. It's actually a complementary effect. So there'll be more vehicle trips, more freight vehicles on the road trying to fulfill often urgent deliveries, like maybe sometimes even 2-hour deliveries are being promised by some companies, which is problematic for urban transport and really adds to the congestion. So I think we can think of solutions ranging from collaborative logistics. How can we try to promote cooperation? Demand management can help also. For example, off-peak deliveries rather than competing with passenger freight demand at the same time on the roads. We can consider alternative vehicle modes like electric trucks or electric cargo cycles. And also things like crowd shipping, tapping on the potential for passengers to fulfill some of these deliveries and tapping on excess passenger transport capacity. So again, the notion of shared mobility comes about, and how do we encourage that in cities? Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lynette. And maybe a question for Justin. I'm actually going straight into all the questions from the audience, because they are great questions and there are variations on some things that you've spoken about. Justin, there's a question for you with regards to what can governments or the private sector do to encourage startups like yourselves, to as you expand into new markets. Obviously, other than money, money is always the obvious answer, but are there other things, changes in policies and all that will help you to gain traction more quickly?
Definitely. You're very right. Money is one of the things that is highly required, but then again, this is a constant. Working with governments and private sectors itself, there's a need to shift the mindset itself. Today we are all in the same race. We are all fighting for the same causes. And if we are able to now see the big picture and now to pivot against how the future will look like, if we are just removing that selfish component that we always have, and that way we will be able to see a bigger drive. An example will be something like, there is a lot of policies and mandates that has been set down in the past. And these policies and mandates, while it worked really well previously, it requires a big shift and a big change. And one of these examples are the way we are driving today. The vehicles that we use in our life today is set by a reasoning that was crafted 100 years ago. But we have been using it for so long, not knowing that it's creating more disruption in our own lives. So if we can look past, what has been said before and adopt what can be, embraced into the future. This is something that I think governments and private sectors can actually now look into to gain financially and to actually have a more holistic environment for everyone as well.
Sorry, thanks. I just muted myself for no reason whatsoever. I think quite a lot of questions regarding a lot of this crystal ball gazing. They relate some of these questions I'm reading. They relate to the fact that has COVID-19 actually pushed back the progress that has been made on encouraging more people to to reduce their carbon footprint by taking buses, public transport, simply by virtue of the fact that there's social distancing, there's an infrequency of of scheduling for these buses and trains. And I'm going to open this question up to anyone who wishes to answer, because I know it's probably more up Andre's alley than anyone else's, but I believe that all of us have probably have an opinion on this. What is your opinion? Has it really pushed us back?
So I wouldn't say it has pushed us back. The numbers right now is in the transportation sector, we see a decline of 17% in emissions, right, globally. So the results, the numbers speak that we're actually contributing to a better environment by not moving right now. And that's been the philosophy for many years, the principles of avoid, shift, improve. So first avoid movement, then shift it to more mass transit, collective transit, higher utilization transit, and then improve the modes which you have, like switching to electric vehicles. I believe personally that the environmental crisis is the biggest crisis of our generation. I'm not getting tired saying this, and that we have to reduce our carbon footprint, not only by our mobility choices, but all the choices we have in life, right? Energy consumption, food, what are you eating, is a big impact on the carbon footprint. It's something which we are responsible as a generation. I hope that people will see through, you look into the posts on Facebook and Instagram, people showing clear skies in China, Hong Kong, in South America, and saying how wonderful it is, the Ganges River with clean water. I hope that starts bring people to think. Maybe I'm an idealist, but I believe in a brighter future.
Thanks, Andre. Does anyone else want to offer an opinion, Lynette or Justin?
Yeah, I share Andre's optimism. I'm also hopeful that these habits will stick. I've learned recently that it takes about 2 months for habits to form. So if we're habituated to meeting like this online, holding work meetings, especially online, I think we can expect that there will be a non-trivial fraction of the working population that can continue this method of interactions and to do that, especially so for long distance business travel. So we're talking about urban mobility, not so much the long haul flights, but for meetings like going to conferences overseas and things like that, we can replace it with virtual interactions, and that can help us towards our low carbon pathway. Yeah.
Well, I think I do agree to both of you as well. But one thing for sure is a constant. I think that today, even though with the work from home situation that a lot of businesses are adopting, there is still a need to move. Okay, whether you need to go somewhere or you need something to move to you. Okay, this whole portion, where the growth of logistics, the growth of e-commerce is rising to the peak today, and we have to look into a solution. We have to look into, not just, as we stay at home and we live our lives in this manner, the change will come about. Okay? We have to address this nevertheless. And I think that we require everyone to have the same mindset, in order for this change to happen.
Maybe I can add a point. So something which Justin and Lynette both said, you guys talked about the utilization, right? And utilization driving actually very highly the environmental indicators. I believe that we are moving more and more to demand responsive models and system-wide optimization. That's also what we see in the scenarios. So 3 out of 4 scenarios are moving this way. And this is where data becomes the holy grail, right? So if you have access into coordinated data, And if you have access to say, I optimize the whole system and match demand and supply rather than individual journeys, this is where we come to a collective optimum. And this is then also where the consumer comes in play and has to understand, okay, if I want this, my sky to be clean and my air to be clean, maybe I sacrifice some of my privacy, even that's not really sacrificing the privacy if it's handled in the right way. But there are some fears of the consumer saying, my mobility data, I don't want third parties or the government accessing it. So we need to develop a safe standard that people feel secure sharing their data, knowing that they're optimizing towards the whole system moving more efficiently, right? It's also you getting faster from A to B, and maybe at a lower cost. So it's inclusion, it's environment, all of it is based on us collectively sharing the data.
Yeah, so I think there are two issues here. One is where there's an optimization of transport needs, actual transport needs, and we'll obviously, if we optimize that, we're going to reach a certain plateau in terms of being able to, to generate less carbon. But there's also an argument to be made for, a paradigm shift in terms of actual vehicles and actual transportation mechanisms that are actually going to shift the carbon emission down significantly just by virtue of the kind of transport mechanisms they use. Electric vehicles is an example, hydrogen fuel cells. I know that one is probably not so popular at this moment, but all these different dimensions to it. Is there, do you see these things actually happening within the next 5 to 10 years, or is it still going to be everyone going to go back to normal and everyone's going to take their bus and everyone's going to drive their car when this thing is going to be lifted? Open to everyone.
On my side, I think that there's an important side on individual behavior, and as we were saying, like if we want, as Andre was saying, if we want a clean sky, how do I make my choices, etc. But I think that it's very important to have in mind the role of public authorities. So I think that this shift to more sustainable mobility will also come if public authorities in cities, in national governments facilitate the access to these cleaner mobility alternatives. So for instance, the extension of bike lanes is important because otherwise there are more road accidents from cyclists, people are less incentivized to use the bikes. If we design more 15-minute cities, then walking and cycling will be easier to become an alternative. If we provide better electrification and charging points, it will be easier to use electric vehicles. So it's not just about private behavior, it's also the public intervention that will help to encourage. So I think that it's very important from citizens to know what they want to ask to their governments and their politicians for the future years.
So the government has got to play its role now. One of the questions that was posed is that a lot of these transport operators are losing money, have lost money during this COVID-19. There's no two ways about it. We know that governments are subsidizing that. Will there be any appetite, do you think, in your respective countries, with your respective experience, do you think there will be appetite by these transport operators to clean, I use the term very loosely in terms of carbon emissions, but to clean up their vehicles without a very strong push by the government to impose this will on them, and perhaps with subsidies? Anyone?
Well, honestly, I don't think that the private sector or the public transportation network itself can be actually enhanced further post-COVID era. Today we are really looking at how the system is going to be used less, okay, and with lesser frequencies, and in order for these companies, okay, whether is it a public sector or a private entity, to actually move into cleaner fuel vehicles, it's going to be a big cost and a big gamble for them. And I think the other way to look at it is that if today we can actually innovate on these companies, which has got not only a track record, but they have got an existing business model already. And if we can change and pivot that model to now encompass, a cross-sectoral approach, to actually not to serve just that existing market, but to serve a new market at the same time. That way they can actually sustain, because without them sustaining a business itself, they can't serve the public better. So this is my whole outlook into how these companies can actually evolve. Singapore is a great example. We have got the public transportation, like the buses and the trains. They are beautiful, they are perfect. And even though I own a car, I do use that system a lot, and I do see that they can bring more value. However, I do see that there's a big problem. They are plying the streets with with that much vehicles at off-peak hours, just going round and round doing nothing, and with very little utilization. This is not optimizing the plant, and we can't just cut this out entirely. So we need to rethink the business model, how we can help these companies out to actually bring more revenue for their sustainability of the business. So this is my take on that.
So I've actually got, sorry, Andre, go ahead.
Yeah, I have to agree with Justin, but I wanted to also put one more point to this. So agreed in terms of we need to get more demand responsive in off-peak hours. So smaller capacities, more demand responsiveness. But then if you look at public transit in many cities, it is the backbone of the society, right? And I've worked with cities where lack of public transport and transportation access led to mobility divide, which resulted in child mortality. So you had children dying in proportionally because people didn't have access to jobs, to services, to education, and these are real numbers, right? So we need to build this backbone of the society, and we need public transport also, not only for the environment but also for the equity, and bringing the lower income families, bring the mobility impaired people into the system. So we do need to fund this. You cannot say, oh, the ridership is going down, we will not have public transport anymore. So I think this is the service to our communities. What the government has to set is a framework how to make it more demand responsible and more increase the utilization in the regions. And I think then the topic of environment goes in line with this, because I mean, everybody knows now that climate change is a scientifically proven fact, and we made commitments in Paris, we made commitments afterwards as nations, and now the governments have to fulfill this duty and those targets.
Yeah, so I think, Andre, you raised a good point. I mean, a lot of countries are going to suffer post-COVID-19. I mean, economies are down. We all know that that's going to happen. A lot of these countries have also are signatories to the Paris Accords, which sort of limits the kind of economic growth that they can artificially create without introducing more carbon into the environment. Do you think that I mean, this is more of a abstract notion. Do you think that governments will have the backbone to have that trade-off where they say, I'm going to be compliant with the accords and I'm going to take the economic impact of that? Or will they say, the economic impact is too heavy for me to bear, I'm going to have to renege on some of my agreements that I signed under the Paris Accords? Do you think that that's, and probably Alba, you can also chip in on that. I don't know. It would appear to me that certain countries are wavering on that at the moment.
I'll make a short statement. It's reframing. It's seeing the long-term opportunity in the gigantic business which there is going with environment-friendly technologies. Like, we're not talking about charity here. We're talking about making money and about business going in line, but in an environmental friendly way. So I think this is the thinking which has to come to the table. How can I innovate and become the leader, rather than how can I adhere to the old status quo where the world is moving forward?
I agree with, sorry.
No, Alba, sorry, I was going to just direct it to you.
No, I agree with what Andre was saying before, that public transport is not just a matter of transportation and even either just a matter of money. It's a matter of providing this access to public services and access to services that people need for their own development. So I think that the duty of the government is also to consider this aspect when taking decisions. And I also think that the investment on public transportation might lead to much more unsustainable situations in the long term. So it is important to maintain this backbone of mobility in cities and in countries still in order to facilitate and to guarantee this equity. And also I think that I also partly agree with Justin that we need still, even if it's important, we need to identify new business models and new ways of making these mobility systems more sustainable, efficient, and competitive in the new post-COVID world. And I think that this implies also from the part of public authority and public transport operations to be open to innovations, to be open to pilot new technologies, to pilot new approaches, to innovate in their business strategies, etc. So I think that we need to reframe or to modernize public transportation, but I would be reluctant to recommend to de-invest or for public governments to disengage from this mode of mobility for what it represents for a lot of people.
This question is probably more for Lynette. Why do you think it is that Singapore has been rather slow to adopt the EV infrastructure? I suppose Justin is smiling. He's got some opinion on that as well. But Lynette, let me give you that give you the opportunity to answer that first.
Yeah. Electrification is a great path to pursue, right? It helps us move away from reliance from fossil fuels, and in terms of emissions. Of course, it has to come along with the investment in a cleaner grid. So it's suitable for markets where the grid is also clean, or where renewable energy can come in a big way. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to pursue electric vehicles. But as for Singapore's case, I'm personally also wondering about this is a gradual, the slow pathway. I think it's needed, it's necessary. It's a necessary investment. Before we see the uptake of electric vehicles, we need to have an adequate number of charging stations. So the plan has been put forth, and we are phasing out internal combustion engines by year 2040. That's been announced, and I think we will start, more aggressively introducing the EV charging stations.
Any of the others have an opinion on why we are so slow? We Singaporeans are so slow in adopting this.
Well, I have a take on this. I'm trying to be a diplomatically correct over here. Okay.
It's okay. It's just recorded. That's all.
Thank you very much. I think Singapore itself is a unique location. Okay, while we are fighting, to move people around, as we all know, to be a economically sustainable country itself, we have to move people around. Goods, people, rubbish even. And while we do this very well, okay, we are also trying our best to limit the number of vehicles on the road. And therefore, rather than saying that why is the adoption of EV infrastructure slow, we have to look into the other aspects. How can we better manage the existing system first? Okay, and the introduction of electric vehicle comes in two prongs. One is the grid infrastructure, two, the electric vehicles themselves. And today, while these technologies are actually not new, there is a lot of unclarity, on the consumer's mind, where they are not sure where these vehicles are going and how these vehicles are being maintained. And for a cost price point of view itself, cars in Singapore are extremely expensive. To buy any EV in Singapore, it costs onwards of 200,000 and above. And if they are not sure how these vehicles are going to last for the next 10 years, this is something that is going to be, heavy on the consumer's mindset. And treading carefully is, I think, one of the best approach. Limiting the number of vehicles on the road is, I think, still the better way. And of course, the introduction of EV through a non-privately owned setup might be the direction.
So if you think about, what I outlined before, avoid, shift, improve. When we talked about the EV, we're on the improve side, but Singapore has moved very efficiently on the avoid and shift, where we're shifting more towards public transit, and where we're creating townships like the 15-minute townships where people don't have to move too much. So Singapore has been very effective in attacking the climate change topic. It just uses other means than the others. And another point why EV has been maybe a little bit slower to start off, maybe it accelerates very fast, I hope so, but slower to start off is because the biggest issue which Singapore has is the space issue. Because space is limited. I think 65% of Singapore is green and national parks, which we cannot touch. I think about 16%, if I'm not mistaken, is for road capacity. Mm-hmm. So we need to decrease that to be able to build more, to provide people with better housing, better offices, better commerce, better recreational facilities. So that's why Singapore has been pushing, for example, very heavily on the AV, autonomous vehicles topic. actually one of the first ones I've been working with since 2015, who we always seen as a reference and leading in that space, and shifting also from just personal mobility to now exploring the whole ecosystem with utility vehicles and trials on commercial vehicles and intralogistics in autonomy. So I think Singapore has been leading in many cases. EV might be the next one. Let's hope that.
Well, I hope so. Honestly speaking, I was rather disappointed when the taxes on the Tesla were basically priced the car out of the market. But it is what it is, and hopefully things will change. I've got Andre. Just to stick with you because there's a question for you. You mentioned mobility as a force for economic. I'm just reading it off the question there. You mentioned mobility as a force for economic inclusion. Micro-mobility is relatively affordable, price point and energy efficient. And I'm assuming by micro-mobility, they're talking about PMDs,
scooters,
scooters and the like. What do you think it takes for mass adoption to happen? And I think this is linked to another question that someone else had with regards to where do you see the future of these PMDs? Probably not in the Singapore context because it's quite highly regulated, but maybe in other parts of the world where just being able to get to a doctor or a clinic more quickly might mean the difference between saving a life and death.
Yeah, probably you will be surprised, but the first topic I'll be talking about is safety, right? If you can educate people to ride properly and create also the infrastructure to increase the safety of operation, that will be the number one. And I think we'll see more and more PMDs as people are coming out of the lockdowns and the COVID pandemic, because it helps to distance yourself, so and have a personal means of transport which is still comparably cheaper, right? It's still not as cheap as public transport. It's still not as efficient, but it's cheaper. So addressing the safety topic, proving that there is an environmental benefit, and not only on CO2 but also local emissions, will be important. And then educating people of how to use the devices, and making the devices also from the engineering standpoint more safe. I think these are the three topics I would see to make them more available in the public.
Mm-hmm. Any of the others? Do any of the others have any opinion on that as well? No. Albert, I'm directing this question at you because it's very specific to the UNDP. I suspect I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it of you anyway. The question is: the UNDP will the UNDP revisit and revise the SDG targets due to post-COVID-19 impact globally? Do you think that they will revise the targets?
I think that the targets, no, I think that the majority of topics will continue. So the SDGs cover the full range of human development and the majority of sectors and trends that need to be covered. Then that's true that maybe in international negotiations between states, there will be some kind of approach to that, but there still is something that the states want to do by themselves. So I think that what we should be talking about is more how can we reimagine everything in order to keep working for these targets, instead of just saying like, okay, we are in a crisis, maybe we will revise them. So I think that it's more focusing on innovating and reassessing our activities to keep for these targets.
Thanks. Again, another question for everyone here. It's an interesting question because we have talked a lot about urban mobility in the context of electric vehicles or different energy sources, but we've never really talked about something which used to be talked about quite a bit in the last few years, which was autonomous vehicles. Do you see COVID-19 speeding up the pathway towards, they would term it an L5, which is a fully autonomous vehicle? Or do you still see that the technology is lagging, the desire to coexist on the roads or to coexist on transportation pathways with such vehicles is still something that needs a few more years to get around? Open question to anyone who wants to answer.
I think I can answer this question pretty well. I'm someone that works on autonomous vehicles. We have been developing mobile robots and autonomous technologies into our products. One of the things about autonomous vehicles is that it is not that the technology is not ready. The technology is pretty much ready, and to have level 5 autonomy is somewhat of the near future. But what is lacking right now is not the technology, but the regulations, the insurance, and of course, the people's awareness to such products. So there is a lot of people that are still not comfortable to ride in a vehicle that has got no driver in it. Okay, governments are not ready to ply these vehicles on the roads to work hand in hand with other driven vehicles by human beings. And of course, the insurance is something that it will take forever to actually get around, to actually have vehicles, work side by side with other vehicles. And when an accident do happen, the finger pointing game will start. And we need to actually address all these matters today. And therefore, it will then accelerate, the move of autonomous vehicles. But from now to then, it could be a 5 years, 10 years thing down the road. And we know these numbers are relatively real. But the post-COVID has definitely accelerated because the need is today. The need for it is today. And we have to do something about that.
So Justin, there are some things I agree with you and some things I disagree. I've been working on the autonomous topic since 6 years. I actually started the initiative on urban and autonomous mobility for the World Economic Forum. Where I agree is we will see more adoption in logistics applications and in closed environments. A, it's easier, B, it's safer, and C, it's where the need is right now post-COVID, right? Where the speed of automation, we spoke about people willing to have their goods delivered very quickly. What I think is dangerous is to say the technology is there yet for mass adoption. I don't believe so. Working with a lot of companies also for the past 3 years in China, it is a highly, it depends on the environment where you operate, right? If you're in a complex city, say you're in Mumbai, it's very hard for an autonomous vehicle to distinct things. Whereas when you're in a geofenced environment, then yes, you're absolutely right. So I think we're on the same page with this, but we need to be careful. And I believe that public opinion has been and will always be the biggest topic of adoption. And this is, again, how can we bring as an ecosystem, right? So collaboration, community of practice, bring the consumer closer to technology. We did a pilot in 2015, 16, 17, I don't remember the years, in Boston. We supported it from the World Economic Forum. And what we did there was robot block parties. So we brought the vehicles to the consumers, like a petting zoo for autonomous vehicles and robots, where you see people getting more familiar with the technology and taking away the fear. And once you have a ride in there, you actually get much more eager to ride an autonomous vehicle because you see that a lot of it is seamless and safe. But I agree with you. These are the biggest point to get the adoption going.
Yeah, we've done some studies at SUTD too, looking at the acceptance of autonomous vehicle technologies in different places, different cities, and also focusing on Singapore, of course. We found some interesting things about how the receptiveness is very high locally. So people are actually looking forward to AVs being rolled out soon. So I think there is some optimism compared to other cities. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to have one last question for you, and it's for all of you, in fact, because it is a pretty general question. It is an extension to that last question that I asked. And unfortunately, this has got to be the last question because the questions are just keep on coming in. So I think it's a very vibrant discussion, but we don't want to be here till about 7 o'clock. So I think the question really is that, we've spoken a lot about and Andre, you alluded to this different development stages of the different markets that this urban mobility solutions are entrenched. And the question really is, it is always the more developed countries that get the better technological advances, and those who are perhaps less developed, less wealthy. Is there a solution for them that, is there a trend or is there a pathway for them in this post-COVID-19 world in terms of urban mobility? Is anything going to change for them, or is it still going to be that bicycle? Which is not a bad thing, or is it still going to be that very polluting, truck that has not been, serviced for like 10 years or something along those lines? So open to everyone to share your views on that. Do you see a future, a change in the post-COVID-19 urban mobility world for perhaps less developed countries?
I would say yes. So low and middle income countries have also been affected by COVID, and there have been many changes in how mobility has been going on during these last months. And it also provokes reflection in these countries, and they also have quite vibrant innovation ecosystems that can provide new ideas. So we have seen, like in some countries, in ideas to facilitate safety measures and cleaning hands in public transportation, like mobile places where to wash hands, etc. So, and also they have different solutions. They have been exploring more biking, more other more sustainable transport. So I think that there's the possibility and the real option that there will be changing, and mindsets there are also changing. So people are getting more used to that. People are also getting more used to shared mobility solutions, to more sustainable, to cleaner. So I think that there will be a change with different solutions from richer countries, but I think that it can be as powerful.
Justin, your business operates in Vietnam, obviously. It's a growing economy, but obviously not probably first world at the moment yet. How do you overcome this? Were the Vietnamese open to adopting the solutions that you offered them?
Well, surprisingly, yes. Okay, I think Vietnam is one of those fastest growing countries in the world right now, and one of the things is that the cities and the nation itself is growing at such a fast pace that they are not actually able to cope with that expansion. And even people today in Hanoi, I'll give an example. Hanoi is bustling, and they are just spilling out of the seams today. And the economical growth potential is so great that there's two portions where people trying to enter the city and there's people trying to exit the city. And with this itself, you see the way that they are commuting has changed, and they are trying to find other ways and means to actually serve their needs better. And when we introduce our platform to such a place, and they're easily adapted to it, and they are seeing the value to it, and they are actually educating us in return on how we can better manage such a business model in a location like that to form fit and to actually profit from it at the same time. So there was a lot of improvements that we do see, going into a country like Vietnam. It is of course tough, where you need a lot of local context to guide you along the way. But I think the experience end of the day is far more valuable than anything else.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. Andre?
I'll make a philosophical statement. So when do we innovate? Innovation comes from a place of discomfort, right? And this is what you described. These countries are hit much harder than any other country. And this is where we as humans start to come out and leapfrog and bring new solutions, right? You go hunting when you're hungry. And I believe that we'll see a lot of innovation coming, something we don't even think about right now, coming from the countries which are most hit and which experience the most inequality. This is where people get creative, and they will show us the future, I think.
Lynette, do you want to round up the session? You started the session, you can round it up.
Yeah, I mean, lots of great opinions. I'm really glad to see all the different perspectives coming together. I want to come back to Alba's point about the role of policymakers and all that, because mobility is very closely linked to how the city is planned and land use and how that's spread out. So if we hear about the case of Hanoi from Justin, about how there's this tension between the growing of the city and how the city is attracting a lot more people into it. So I think careful planning would be required to achieve the goal of that 15-minute cities that Andre mentioned also, and then that would help solve part of the mobility issues that we're trying to address. Yeah.
Okay, Lynette, thank you very much. Panelists, any last words you want to say, or do I wrap it up? Okay, if nothing, then panelists, thank you very much for your invaluable contribution today. Those who have attended and stayed all the way to the end, which is actually most of you, thank you for joining us. I'm sure there's another one that my colleagues and UNDP will be organizing very, very soon. I hope to see you guys there. Otherwise, have a great morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are, whether India, Europe, and all that. Thank you very much, guys. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Next week.
Tuan Wei Ming, anything for you that we need to do?
No, Shinwei, I think it's all good.
Okay.
Yep.
Justin,
We're not live
Hendrik,
anymore? Okay.
I look forward to seeing both of you guys in person. Hopefully, when this thing is lifted. Okay, thank you very much, Justin.
You're invited to come to the center. That's the virtual background. So we have a physical center actually. Come
look
visit
forward
us.
to that. Yeah. Okay. Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.